Hello, and welcome to our lesson on gross domestic product. Here to help us explain how we measure an economy is our friend EmoChicken 1 and EmoChicken 2. These little guys are going to represent our productive resources and help us to understand how we measure economic activity. Here's EmoChicken again, and here's an egg. For every chicken we have, we get an egg. So if we were to measure our economy in eggs, then the more chickens we had, the more eggs we would get. And the more eggs we would get, the better off we would be. So EmoChicken says GDP is a measure of the productive capacity of an economy and helps us understand whether a country is wealthy or poor or how that country is doing. So EmoChicken says the more eggs, the happier we all are. All right, so we all know that eggs are wholesome and delicious, and they're very useful for so very many things, which is why it makes a really good example, at least of understanding some of the mechanics of how we calculate GDP. So imagine, if you will, my household represents an economy. So for every chicken that I have, I get an egg, and I get one egg each day. So if I wanted to calculate, on average, how many eggs I get a year, I would take the egg that I have each day times the number of days in the year, that'd be about 365. And then I would multiply that times the number of chickens that I have. So 6 eggs a day is how much my 6 chickens will get me. So this represents about 1 week worth of eggs from my little hens. Now, this looks like a lot of eggs. And if I were the only one in my household and this is the only source of things that I had, this would be a lot of eggs. But now imagine that I have more than just me in my household. So let's say I've got 6 people in my household. Then even though I have a lot of total eggs, I have about 120 eggs here. That once I take into account that if I had 6 people in my household, each one of us would only be getting 1 egg a day. And 1 egg a day really isn't that much. And so the total size of your GDP, also, that's one measure of how big an economy is. So in this case, if I was the only person in my household, the 6 eggs a day would be a ridiculously large amount of eggs, and I would be very wealthy in eggs. However, once we account for the fact that there's more people in my household or more people in our economy and in our country, then we realize that even though 6 eggs a day is a lot, if we have 6 people in our household, it's still only 1 egg a day. So the total size of the economy has to be adjusted for the number of. This really makes a difference when we look at, for example, the GDP of China versus the GDP of America. So currently, the GDP of China is either bigger than or near the size of the United States. However, the populations are really, really different. So once you account for the total number of people in the population, you'll see that the relative size of GDP is much different. So for example, the United States has a large number of people, but we also have a really large GDP. If you look at India, if you look at China, and we look at some other countries, and we're going to pull those graphs up in a minute, you'll see that there's a really big difference. So once you account for population, it's kind of like saying that, yes, I have a lot of eggs, but if there's a lot of people in my country, we still don't really have enough, do we? And so that's kind of one of the essential differences. So that is called GDP per capita. So GDP per capita takes your total number of goods and services that you've produced in your country in the year, the value of all the finished goods and services, and it divides it by the total number of people that that economy supports. And that's called our GDP per capita, because GDP measures gross domestic product, which measures the total value of goods and services produced in an economy. And per capita means per person. So if we measure our economy in eggs, then the more chickens and the more eggs, the better off we are. Now, in a very literal sense, the more eggs we have, the more we can eat, and the better off our society is. But a basket full of eggs goes a long way. All right, so another really important issue when we think about measuring GDP is a couple of points. Is we need to figure out what's included in GDP and what's not included in GDP, because the real economy is, of course, more complicated than one chicken, one egg, right? So in the real world, an economy produces a vast amount of goods and services over the course of a year. So when we think about what GDP is measuring, what it's measuring is the value of all the finished goods that are produced within the country within a year. So a good question to start asking is, well, what's included in GDP and what's not included in GDP? So since I'm standing in my kitchen today, and we're doing a whole example of eggs and chickens, that one of the things that struck me that is a really obvious example of something that's not included in GDP is my stove. So this is my oven and my stove, and it's a beauty. It is an absolute work of art, functional, beautiful work of art. Now, the thing about this particular stove is, so I bought it last year, at the very end of last year, but if I were looking at GDP for 2021, one of the questions that we would want to ask is this stove included in GDP? I bought it, so I bought this stove in 2021, so is it included in GDP? Well, no, because this stove happens to be about 75 years old. It was made in about 1949. So even though I purchased it and I acquired it this year, the stove is not included in GDP because it was produced and it was included in the GDP of 1949. So this, not in GDP. However, paid a plumber to come in and install it for me. That $50 is included in GDP. So the services that were provided in 2021 are new, and they're considered part of the value of the finished goods and services. Okay, so the stove itself is not included in GDP because it was manufactured in about 1949. But the services of the plumber that installed it for me last year, that is included in GDP. So that's how we need to think about things. Used goods are not included in GDP because they were counted in the year that they were actually produced. Now, services that are provided in that year are included in GDP. So, quick note, used goods, no. Services, yes. Okay. So when we think about what GDP is measuring, it's measuring current, for whatever year you are looking at, it's measuring the size of that economy and the value of the goods and services produced. Now, those change a lot over time. So our next concept that we're going to talk about is nominal versus real GDP. What does that mean? We can't compare those two values at all because what $500 was in 1949 is a very different thing than what $500 is in 2022. Okay. So another really important concept that we use in economics is the difference of nominal versus real. Well, what does that mean? Because everything is real if it existed, right? But that's not what we're talking about here. Nominal versus real is referencing what unit dollar you're talking about. So in 1949, this stove sold for around $500. Now, does that make that a really expensive stove back then? Does it make it a cheap stove? We don't know because $500 in 1949 was radically different than $500 today. $500 in 1949 was a really big chunk of change. $500 today, while not insignificant, isn't as much. So we're going to do some calculations in a couple minutes where I'll show you just how dramatically prices can change. So if we compared this stove in 1949 dollars to an equivalent stove today in 2022 dollars, you would have two totally different things. You'd be comparing apples and oranges. So you really need to be careful to make sure that everything is on the same basis. So we want to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges, as it were. Because what we're really trying to understand is in units that make sense for your analysis, that they have to be in the same amount. So if I look at, and we will in a moment, if I look at what GDP was in 1949, if I take that nominal value, it's not going to give me a valid basis for comparison. I need to convert the 1949 dollars into 2022 dollars. And that's something that trips up a lot of students and a lot of people who are trying to understand differences over time. And there's this old joke, as you know, that, elderly individuals like to talk about, when I was a kid, a loaf of bread cost a nickel. Well, what does that mean? How does that compare to what we spend today? So a loaf of bread today can cost you $5. But how does that compare to a nickel? You don't know if you're only looking at the nominal versus the nominal because they're totally different scales. So, EmoChicken is here to explain GDP to us. So, you three get. Unless you want to be on video, and I will show it in class if you act like that. What can a chicken teach us about economics? Good question, isn't it? So, let's tip our hats to the ladies who do all the hard work for us and bring us our food and help put our food on the table. Welcome to another episode of EmoChicken Economics. Today, EmoChicken is going to help us understand gross domestic product.
Introducing EmoChicken!